I recently read an article by the late Ian Hacking, which I found to be incredibly interesting. It's called Making Up People, and when I first came upon it, I was a little hesitant. With a title like that, I was worried that it would be somehow denigrating some minority group, which certainly never goes out of fashion, but I was pleasantly surprised. The central premise of the article is about how categories affect those who become categorized. Hacking is not trying to make some judgment on the categorized. He's merely interested in how names interact with the name, to put it like he puts it. For instance, take a category like autism. Is it a disorder, a disability, or just a functional variation in processing information? Since its conception, the category of autism and autistic people has developed and broadened to include many different kinds of people. The categorization has most definitely changed how people identified and self-conceptualized themselves. Suddenly, a person who previously might just have been seen as a little bit odd is part of this category, which can both help and or hinder them. It changes them in some material way, not only for themselves, but more importantly, how other people see and treat them. When you get this label, there are all kinds of bureaucratic and social things that apply to you, even as the category itself only exists as an idea. In the article, Hacking makes some observations about the life cycles of categories and how they develop and interact with those who get categorized, mostly by quote-unquote normal people. He identifies 10 aspects which I can quickly show on screen here, with a short summary on the right. Hacking summarizes these categories much more succinctly than I can. The first 7 engines in the following list are designed for discovery, ordered roughly according to the times which they became effective. The 8th is an engine of practice, the 9th of administration, and the 10th is resistance to the knowers, what we would call experts who created the category. What Hacking has done here is not to create some comprehensive list, but merely similar patterns which he sees in the creation of new people. For more information, I just suggest you read the article. It's phenomenal, and it's free, and I'll link it down in the description. The article is fascinating in many different ways, but its relevance to me in this moment is something which Hacking says towards the end of the article, which gave me pause. He gave voice to something I had been thinking about for a long time, namely, why I've sometimes felt uncomfortable with the process of science, in particular, psychological trials of mentally ill people. We have this tendency in our culture to use these handy categories we make to better understand the world against those who have been diagnosed with them. The category itself is often handed down or placed upon someone by an authority, a psychologist or social worker in this case, which we have given the trust to wield their power responsibly. While this mostly happens, sometimes, and this is just merely my experience, getting a diagnosis or being labeled in some other way narrows the experience of reality so much that I can get claustrophobic. Suddenly, I don't see the expanse of all possibility, that alluring infinite freedom on the horizon, but I'm boxed in to some social position not of my own creation. I inherit a bunch of stereotypes and attitudes from people who've worn the same clothes before. What this can do is to rob people of their individuality. This mostly happens when we speak about people as if they were their diagnoses. For example, autistic people are this way, or autistic people always do this. Hacking puts it thusly: to speak in the species mode about people is to depersonalize them, to turn them into objects for scientific inquiry. And I would add, cultural analysis. I get this gross feeling sometimes that the instrumentalizing and objectification of reality that science inevitably needs to do to get usable results casts a shadow on how we treat each other, that we get stuck in species mode, as Hacking puts it, and that we forget that behind the categories there exists this human person with a similar soup of consciousness to our own. I've gotten this increasing nervousness over the years that we forget that the categories we use to make up people are not real like the rocks of mountains or the wetness of lakes are. They're more like a shared home, which changes and morphs depending on you and your roommates. There are makings. If someone came into your home and rearranged and threw away things you held dear, you would be in your right to be angry. And so it is with categories. When someone puts stuff in your identity which you didn't put there, you can get defensive and hostile. Although while the categories we make up are not real in the physical sense, they do have material consequences for us. And this point is relevant to other debates in current day politics. But I'll leave that for the astute viewer to figure out. Now, while I would love to discuss abstract ontological or epistemological philosophy with you, and trust me, there's probably time for that some other time, I want to adjust my attention to something more important. Memes. You've probably seen this tweet before. It says in so few words something incredible about modern internet culture. It points towards the human desire for categorization, it points out how new guys get invented, and then finally wraps a bow on it by pointing to the internet's unquenching thirst for anger. If you need a shorthand for what we've been discussing earlier, then this is a handy, albeit incomplete, way of thinking about it. Related to making up a guy, we cannot forgo to talk about wojaks. Wojaks exploded in popularity after they broke containment from 4chan sometime in the late 2010s. In fact, it happened in much the same way that Rage comics broke containment back in the late 2000s. The lesson is that lab leaks from 4chan become pandemic-level events. But wojaks are interesting in the department of making up guys. What differentiates wojaks from Rage comics is that they often describe these types of characters. The NPC, the doomer, the coomer, the soyjack, the zoomer, and the incel chat dichotomy. It introduces to memes a typology, almost scientific sounding, to people and culture, creating species of people depending on temperament and personality. To me, it reads almost like physiognomy, the belief that you can read someone's personality from the way their face looks. This is in opposition to Rage comics, which largely describe a type of situation or a reaction to said situation. Wojaks are interesting to me as they describe a type of guy. And as I made clear in the introduction, when we make up people, we're not immune to the evolution of said character, and that the category typifies the type of human in the world. For example, remember when simp was an acronym, suckers idolizing mediocre pussy? As the term was used more, it started to cluster itself next to related terms, such as white knights. It described men who came to the defense of women or who were in some way overly protective of women. Now, both terms can be used by others with a more nefarious intent, as a mere descriptor of a feminist man or a man who are in some way deficient in game. The term evolves alongside its usage and changes contexts and meanings to us. What we then need to be mindful of is that these typologies are used to describe people we come about online or in the real world, and that our categories of thinking have consequences for the people we identify, as well as for our own self-identification. Another example. In the year 2000, there were probably white women in their late 30s to late 40s with a particular haircut, which made life particularly difficult for people like service workers. There were at least murmurs in the culture that these kinds of women existed. The "can I speak to the manager" woman. But it wasn't until the crystallization of the word Karen
inside! He said that's right!
that we would, as it were, diagnose this condition upon certain people. In fact, when the category itself was created, large swaths of people were suddenly labeled and categorized with certain unfortunate behaviors and stigmas. And then we got Karen metal, Karen cringe compilations, and so on and so on. And while the category can be used to point out particularly bad behavior in certain people, it can also be used to malign broad swaths of people. This name, the category of the Karen, does something to the way we experience not only those looking at a Karen, but also those who get called Karens. With the largely negative connotation that the label carries, it now becomes a category to be avoided and explained away lest you become quote-unquote like them. That's interesting, isn't it? The characterization of the names changes how we think about, and more importantly use, said names. The at times ambiguous traits of internet types can create these little gaps that can be exploited for both good or bad. Take the word simp again. Is it an impotent man, or merely someone who is idealizing a particular person, usually a man idealizing a woman? It is ambiguous to a certain extent, but we can at the very least say that simp does not mean strong and secure man, which adds the layer that the description is not devoid of all content, but that it typifies some specific characteristic of a person. Now, what these characteristics are, or whether it is a neutral description or even a description worth using at all, is up to the community who used the word. And as I was writing this text, I actually came to learn that the word probably has its origins in hip-hop culture as an antonym for being a pimp. And it was not shocking at all to find that it had been morphed from hip-hop culture into something different when it made contact with the manosphere and incel communities. Although, the word still contains within it certain ideals about what a man ought to be.
This sounds very gay.
Speaking of men, let's talk about Chad. Chad came out of incel typology, wide and varied as it is, as a biologically determined pussy magnet Übermensch, and has kind of morphed into something more amorphous. A Chad can be all the standard typifiers of masculinity, or merely just anything that agrees with the poster's opinion. It has now become an empty signifier, or to say it in less pretentious terms, it can mean almost whatever you want, like freedom or justice. But let's get back into it before we stray too far from our main point. When we create these internet typologies, what we are in a sense doing is making up new ways of seeing human beings in the world. Or as Ian Hacking calls it, we're making up people. Categories like incel, doomer, or Karen not only describe something, but in many ways can become a kind of judgment you put on a person. And it becomes what Hacking calls speaking in species mode, or to talk about them as if they're only confined to the categories. This is one of the things I at times find highly problematic with these kinds of hasty categorizations we find on the internet. I worry that people, often young men stuck in manosphere or incel communities, take these categories not as ideas, but as reality. At the same time, I don't want to be a buzzkill. If done in a more or less harmless way, many of these categories can be used as playful banter among friends. Because I have to be honest, it's funny to call someone Coomer-brained. The problem is that many people actually take these categories as scientific entities, as a kind of real metaphysical entity that you can find in a person. And I'm sorry to have to break it to you, but Chad does not exist as anything else other than all the things that you wish you were. It's an idea. Thinking that Chad exists as something other than a reflection of your own beauty standards, that you could in some way locate Chadness, is of course not only untrue, but it leads you to some bad thinking. On the level of external judgment, it is bad because it leads you to see a person strictly as the category. But a person is not a category. Categories and classifications exist to be helpful to us, but when you mistake the map for the territory, you're not only missing all the details which the territory includes, but you're also ignoring all the distortions that are necessarily introduced in the representation of the territory. Now, you're being silly when you do this to maps, but when applied to people who have life trajectories and desires of their own, you're more often than not doing something unethical. And you probably wouldn't want someone else to do that to you. In psychology, this would be called the fundamental attribution error, or mistaking a situation for the character of a person. Maybe the woman who gets angry at the checkout personnel isn't a Karen, but merely someone who was just put in a bad spot. It doesn't mean that they're not being an asshole. All I'm saying is that maybe it isn't a character defect, but just a shitty response to a shitty situation. Or maybe they are entitled. I'm not saying that either is true, but if you think that you can understand someone's personality from a 2 to 5 minute YouTube clip, you're being narrow-minded. I'm merely opening the doors for multiple interpretations. But it's not just how we judge others which makes this toxic. I often think back to a point made in that famous ContraPoint video about incels. Natalie talks about how incelese, the language that incels use, kind of colonized her thoughts about herself and others. The terms would come about to her when she was out and about, and she would start to change the way she was thinking. Change the language you're thinking in, the concepts, the categories that you use, and you start to change how you think. Take something like the black pill, which is as much a judgment on the external world as it is judging yourself to be eternally unfuckable or unlovable. In psychoanalysis, this would be called splitting, or black and white and all or nothing thinking. Splitting is a defense mechanism to make consciousness easier to cope with. It sounds like, at least if I'm forever undeserving of love, I cannot get hurt further by someone rejecting me. And when you think that it couldn't get worse than being merely unfuckable, the incel categories themselves are seldom loaded with much nuance for change. And this is indeed a tendency for a lot of the internet's essentializing categories. You're determined by your status, or circumstance, or biology to never change. You're being ossified into being only one thing. If you're bad now, you will always be bad. But talk to any biologist about biology, and you will quickly find out that our biological makeup, while important, it won't fully determine your trajectory in life. Organisms change and adapt to their environments. And it's the same thing with class. In sociology, they measure what's called social mobility. In short, moving up or down the class ladder. It can be made more or less malleable depending on how we want to model society. In Scandinavia, for instance, there used to be a lot less social mobility than there is now. Not to say that that hasn't changed recently, but circumstances can change, is my point. That is something that a lot of people can swear on. What terrifies me about the essentializing thoughts is that it makes people go into species mode. It makes them feel as if they're a scientific species doomed to an indifferent void of statistics. Similarly, they start to see others in the world in a similar manner. It's this cold way of thinking that deprives you of so much that exists outside of the category you've been placed within. It just narrows your life unnecessarily. What I don't want to impress upon you in this video is that I'm somehow against categorization. If, for the sake of argument, you have recurrent obsessive thoughts which terrify you and you have to do a particular thing to alleviate your anxiety, you're not a bad person who is getting what they deserve. You might just have OCD. This, however, does not mean that you are your OCD, only that you currently happen to fit into this handy category we've made up, and that other people who also fit into this category respond to certain treatments. Sure, your thoughts fall into this pattern of OCD now, which is painful for sure. To a certain extent, your thinking is you, but it isn't you entirely. First off, you aren't always caught in thinking in these spirals. there are also other parts of you which aren't OCD either. You are that breath that can calm you down, your body that grounds you. But more important here, it's the sense that you don't want to live like this. There's a will that says that this is uncomfortable, and that leaves you open for change. The category of OCD is useful because it gives us an indication of a kind of thinking cycle, which can be very distressing, and then it suggests treatments for said thinking cycles. So categories can be very helpful. Like, if you find comfort in identifying with OCD, I have no interest in taking that comfort away from you. But just be mindful that you don't do the same thing that ignorant people do when they use your disorder as a synonym for being excessively neat. OCD is a category which may currently describe your anxious thoughts, or a tendency you might fall continuously into, but it isn't you entirely. Be careful of essentializing yourself. The trouble I have with typologies, particularly the meme ones that we throw around online, is that while they're fun, they introduce boxes for the supposedly boxless generation. While many might feel weird about establishing firm political or religious identities, and might even balk at the idea of being called, say, a conservative, millennials and Gen Z have veritably boxed themselves in as 25-year-old thinkers, cottagecore, weirdcore, cyber dolls, all kinds of e-boys, e-girls, e-everythings, tradcast, witchcore, pastel grunge, Christian girl autumn, scene tweens, NPCs, sad boys, sad girls, dream punk, soft boys, soft girls, big brains, Wojak, doomers, brainlets, every ideological marker that you could possibly think of, and a whole fucking host of starter packs of every goddamn situation under the sun. And when you've categorized your entire existence, what are you doing it for? Is it for some sort of shape and control? You translate types of people like animals to a taxonomy. And don't we see that the categorizations come with an almost ordered set of species with their own moral universe? Now, if you don't think that that's the case, why does this image make any sense at all? A huge point of Wojak templates is that they have moral content to some degree. That they portray characters who are good and admirable, like Chad or Giga Chad or Tradwife, all displaying a particular male fantasy, I might add. And on the other hand, you have the supposedly unflattering daddy's girl or the obese Wojaks, etc., etc. We elevate certain perspectives and denigrate others. We play with these characters online, sometimes oblivious about what we're doing. Although some of you know exactly what you're doing. But then again, I don't want to ruin the fun of memes, or even just like getting mad at the type of guy. I actually think it shows something very interesting about our tendency as animals, that this is something that we've spent an inordinate amount of time doing. Wojaks are obviously very useful and fun to us, seeing as how they're so prominent online. People collect them like rare Pepes. I obviously think they're funny, seeing as I've written 3,500 words about them, but I think about how much we actually honestly talk about them. Many people say that they're just jokes that we shouldn't take too seriously. But people do tend to take them pretty seriously, seeing as they've become this shorthand for how we identify and feel about each other. We tend to find new guys to invent. And I think that's actually a very interesting ability that we have of sorting through our sense impressions and then finding patterns. It's fascinating that we like and find these categories useful. But we also use them in places where they're not useful or appropriate. And this leads to distorting our thinking. Even worse, this inclination can be used or weaponized against you to make you think in ways which are not only impractical, but also actively harmful. And all of this is just from how we identify and make up people. Our pattern recognition isn't always as worthwhile as we might think. Sometimes it leads you to make up a guy to get mad at. then why would you want to be angry all the time? But hey, these are just some thoughts for the road. Thanks for watching.